Welcome to another episode of the Mighty Finland podcast, a podcast on all things military from the high north. My name is Ville, and at the beginning of June, I attended the Summer School of Rhetoric, an event that combines security and communications. And there I had the chance to interview two very interesting people. Here we have Keir Giles, an author and expert on the Russian military, with whom we discussed the Russian war in Ukraine, the threat that Russia poses, as well as disinformation and the UK's new defense review.
All right, let's talk Ukraine, Russia, and obviously also Finland. Sitting with me is Keir Giles, author and Russia expert, especially on the Russian military, I believe. Welcome and thanks for taking the time to talk.
Thank you.
Was that is that author and Russia expert? Does that cover it? Is there a favorite pastime you want mentioned or anything?
There's plenty of other stuff besides, but yeah, for the purpose of this conversation, let's just stick with author and Russia watcher. Professional explainer of Russia is how it tends to be working out these days.
All right, and in this day and age,
yeah,
something that we really need.
Apparently, yes, still, in spite of everything.
How is that? I'm going to go off script immediately from the top. In Finland, you don't need to do that much Russia explaining.
Mm.
How do you view what you have to explain about Russia in Finland, for example, or how it's explained here versus Western Europe?
Well, Western Europe has been catching up. So you still have the same old problem that you always did. There's a gradient from east to west of understanding of the problem and the threat that Russia poses, and therefore what needs to be done to prevent it. But the rising tide of understanding what Russia is about has lifted all the boats across Europe. So you don't have to have in Western Europe, in old NATO, the same conversations that once upon a time you would have had to do, first of all, establishing that Russia is going to be a problem. That's been established for us very kindly by Vladimir Putin, which is why I dedicated one of the previous books to him, because he's done us all an enormous favor. So it's just one example of the kind of spade work that we used to have to do as Russia explainers before you could have a serious conversation. Yes, Russia does have hostile intent. No, enlargement of NATO is not the reason why Russia invades its neighbors. All of these different things that previously we would have had to thrash out before actually getting to the meat of what's going on, now is far, far easier. Having said that, of course, it's the response to it. It's the way in which countries actually rise to the challenge and structure their preparedness for what they see coming their way from Russia that is still radically different across the continent. Now, you have the frontline states, the ones that are making themselves hard targets as urgently as they can, given their national capacity. Then the other end of the continent, you have Ireland, which still thinks it is protected by distance. It thinks it's protected by neutrality. It has a foreign aid budget, which is larger than its defense budget, and it's largely outsourced protection of its air and maritime space to the UK. So the extremes across the continent are still very stark, but there is more of an understanding of where the problem is going to come from.
I heard an analogy to this a while ago that even within Ukraine, you can go to Kiev and someone there might not have the right picture or necessarily always understand what the situation is frontline. And from our point of view, that's pretty close to the front line.
Yeah.
And the gradient sort of starts there and goes all the way to Belgians and the Irish and stuff like that. And it's been painstaking to follow that. The countries are finally waking up, but at the same time, like could you wake up a couple of years ago?
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And the geography, even just the basic facts of geography and what Russia has been practicing to do, still escape not just publics, but apparently some of our decision makers as well. It is astonishing how often you still hear from the western reaches of Europe, well, we're fine because look at the map. There's all of that between us and the problem. And that's kind of overlooking that small, unfortunate fact that unlike on a map, the world isn't actually flat. And so when those Russian bomber pilots fly what they call Zaugel, going round the corner, around the top of Norway, as soon as they're in the Norwegian Sea, they're in missile range of Western Europe, effectively. And that is something which is still not quite joining the dots in consciousness of where the threat's going to come from and whether you are protected if you're not actually in that front line.
Yeah. Yeah. Somehow it feels, what's the word, comforting that we're not the only ones being threatened, you know? Just because we're a frontline state doesn't give anyone else in the real world, doesn't give them that much leeway. Now, whether or not they understand that on every different levels of their societies, of course, a different conversation.
Well, we have a lot of conversations about where the next Russian move might be, but of course, that's a constantly shifting equation. You still have the poster children for that conversation. It's the Baltic states, occasionally Finland, but of course, that's not the only place where Russia would actually get the political results that it wants, and that's a very different question to where is it actually militarily prepared to attack. And the good old analogy of outrunning a bear still works here. If you're looking for who is the most tempting target for Russia, just think when you're running away from a bear, you don't need to be faster than the bear. You've just got to be faster than your slowest friend. So it works.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right, let's talk Russia, Ukraine. We're heading into the summer of 25. It's been 3 years since the start of this part of the war, the full-scale invasion. How would you summarize the situation right now?
Pretty static. In spite of all of the surprises that Ukraine continues to deliver, the overall big picture status of the war has remained the same for months. We've known for a long time that the war is not going to be decided on the front line, probably not even necessarily in Ukraine. It is the maneuvering of the backers of Ukraine and of Russia that is actually going to decide the outcome. There, of course, we've seen the efforts by the United States to push Russia's terms of surrender on Ukraine and blackmail Ukraine into accepting them. But that's been limited by the extent to which the US can actually push forward any outcome or any solution without the cooperation of Vladimir Putin, which they seem to have assumed, and which, to be fair, a lot of us assumed as well. We thought that they would be working in much closer cooperation than seems to be the case. So that leaves the Russian armed forces grinding steadily forward at immense cost in casualties in very much the same way that they have been doing now for months already, while incurring steadily greater losses, not least thanks to Ukrainian innovation, as we saw with the drone attacks on strategic aviation just a few days ago now. So Ukraine will continue to pull surprises out of its hat. Russia will continue to push forward. The rest of the world will still engage in this strange choreography where we're second-guessing all the time what the United States is going to do next, but none of it is actually going to change the facts on the ground.
What's your take on the drone attack that Ukraine just did, or whatever else they've done lately in terms of the deep strike?
Well, the conversation I would really have liked to hear when going into the stages of planning of that drone strike is looking at the timeline and the preparations 18 months ago. At this stage, they must have been at by, say, early May. The decision that was made not to target Red Square and make the even bigger propaganda splash would have been an interesting one. So there are technical elements to it as well. I think we can assume that any attack that was, in fact, piggybacking on the Russian mobile phone network would have had different challenges around central Moscow when that network is effectively shut down, GPS affection, whatever, all of the electronic countermeasures that were in place. But still, there must have been a huge temptation to show the world that you can actually strike at the center of Russian power, as well as one of the levers of Russian power. So it's obviously focused minds around the rest of the world as well, because as so often happens, you have a practical demonstration of a threat that many people have described coming, but nobody quite believes it until it's shown, until you see just what the enormous costs are on the basis of a relatively inexpensive operation.
Yeah. What are some key things that you focus on as you there's a lot going on with the war. What are the things that you focus on?
These days it is, I don't do the tank counting, I don't do the plane counting, and haven't done that for quite some time. It is more to do with the high level, the strategic, the geopolitics, and particularly what's going on around the war that is actually going to influence the outcome. While still, of course, keeping at the back of my mind the fact that we cannot know for certain what the real state of Ukraine's resilience and endurance actually is. And there are probably very few people that do know the real situation here. So for all of the external appearance that Ukraine is holding Russia back, sometimes there may be other factors which simply are not visible from the outside. And right from the very early stages of the conflict, what it has reminded of is countries that appear to be holding their own in a war, but actually recognize internally that it is not sustainable. And whether at some point there has been, or might be in the future, a point where Ukraine says, yes, the front line is static, but it is not possible to continue this way, so something has to give. And of course, the natural analogies are Finland in 1940 and 1944. It looks to the world as though you've stopped the Red Army more or less dead, but at the same time, it cannot continue. So there has to be a painful acceptance of defeat.
Mm. So there are social factors, there are economic factors, something.
All of these things, yes. Social, economic, demographic, military, energy, all of the different things that will play into the continued ability of the Ukrainian state to function, which also looks resilient from the outside, but it's hard to get the true picture.
Yeah. Well, brings me to perfectly, you've walked right into my ambush, because the next question is, how is Ukraine doing? There's you said the situation is static. Ukraine seems to be sort of on the back foot, but also they're making these deep strikes. How do you view their position from what you know, from what you see?
Well, let's think about the different ways in which those deep strikes were important. So yes, it eliminates a proportion, we don't know exactly what proportion, of Russia's strategic aviation. It will slightly alleviate the pressure on Ukraine's cities because it removes some of the means by which Russia was delivering those strikes. But at the same time, possibly the more important aspect of this is, again, external to Ukraine. It is the counter-argument to those parts of the world that have been convinced for a long time that Ukraine is doomed, that it is on the ropes, and that Russia is winning, and there's only a matter of time before Ukraine has to surrender because it cannot fight back. It's a prime example of Ukraine being able to carry the fight to the enemy, being able to pull out surprises, and actually being able to embarrass Russia. The more of that happens, the harder it is to argue that Ukraine has a ticking clock, and they have no choice but to accept the surrender terms that are put on them by Russia.
That's the analogy of them having no cards, so to speak.
And there was the ace up their sleeve all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That must have been, I don't know if he, surely he was briefed on what was going on, but with the conversation there and the planning going on, that must have been.
It would have taken extraordinary presence of mind to be thinking of that at the time when he was being ambushed by Trump and Vance.
That's true. That's true. What has Ukraine going for them? What are some good aspects in what they're doing right now?
The rapid pace with which Ukraine has attempted to become self-reliant. Right from even before the time when they recognized that US aid was going to be limited and, more to the point, was going to be conditional, and that those conditions that the United States was setting were also placing limitations on what other partners in the coalition could do. So that drive to look for means by which Ukraine could defend itself without being beholden to any external partner that would seek to constrain that is now, of course, bringing results, with the percentage of homegrown defense potential that is involved in the war steadily creeping up. Faster, it seems, than European countries' own efforts to reinvigorate the defense industries, both for their own purposes and for supporting Ukraine. But still, it's a process that has actually started. So if that continues, and if the aid from the United States continues to attenuate and isn't renewed, then eventually there comes a point where Ukraine is simply not beholden to US pressure and US leverage. And instead of the concerns about the US cutting Ukraine loose, it can be the other way around.
Interesting. Yeah, what's happening in the Ukrainian startup scene is really interesting, and I would say this, that usually when there's talk of startups, I'm not interested in that question. I get sketchy and itchy, and it's just not a conversation I want to have about different startups. But if it's Ukrainian defense tech startups, that's an interesting question. There, I have no issue with it.
Well, they are in a field where there's a great deal of growth and incentivization for startups to succeed.
Oh yeah. All right. What about Russia then? First of all, like militarily, how are they doing right now?
It's one of the conversations that we have again and again and again. And in fact, knowing that it was one of the first questions that was going to come up when I talked about the potential for Russia to launch an attack beyond Ukraine in this book here, that's the reason why it's the very first topic that I come up with. The impression that so many people have that the Russian war machine has been eviscerated to an extent that it's not capable of doing anything else, which was a reasonable conclusion for people to draw from looking at what happened in the very early stages of the war to Russia's land forces, but of course is the incomplete picture. Not just because of the way the land forces have been rebuilt and regenerated to a force that is fighting a different war, but is still capable of delivering immense destruction. Also, the way when people say that force has been stopped, or at least slowed to close to a standstill by the Ukrainian forces, so plainly Russia can't attack elsewhere, they are forgetting that those Ukrainian forces are themselves huge, well-equipped, well-trained, and are very, very different from a European army that would encounter Russia's military for the first time. Then, of course, all of Russia's ways of delivering strikes at immensely long ranges. Strategic aviation has taken a hit, but the Navy is largely unscathed beyond the Black Sea. And of course, all of the ways that Russia has been practicing doing damage and causing harm through semi-clandestine, semi-covert means are still at their disposal. The cyber warfare, the proxies, the arson, the assassination, etc. So there are plenty of different ways in which Russia can very definitely still spoil our day, some of which tend to be overlooked in the conversations about how they have been stopped dead in Ukraine.
Right. What's your take on the Russian population, the atmosphere there, the social situation? Obviously, it's very much an outside look in, but what's your take on that situation now in terms of the war?
We don't see anything other than continued enthusiastic support for the war and urging our boys in Ukraine on to commit more and better genocide. And those people that disapproved of that or didn't want to be involved in it tend to have self-selected out of that population by emigrating in successive waves. So what's left behind is not only, on average, a more homogenous population with similar views, but also is very well aware that any kind of opposition to the war, let alone any kind of protest, will bring consequences. And so you don't do that.
Do you see any possibility that would change, that people would somehow stand up, or that would change the atmosphere or something?
Not in the foreseeable future, because let's not forget the war has been pretty good for a lot of people in Russia. The vast quantities of money that have been showered on the regions in recruitment bonuses, for example, lifting their standard of living into something which is sort of recognizable as almost the 20th century. And the way in which, of course, it gives a sense of mission and a sense of purpose, and the kind of surrogate state religion for the Russian Federation, especially when it is tied to victory in the Second World War and tapping into all of those emotional triggers for the population as well. So there's a pattern that we were considering when it might actually replicate in Russia in the context of this war, where Russia does repeatedly spend itself into state collapse in pursuit of a war over and over again, like 1905, like 1917, 1991, etc. But the real trigger, the thing that is missing from the present day, but was a trigger for all of those previous occasions, is people across Russia being genuinely unhappy and getting to the point where they were hungry. That's not going to happen for a long time, because for the time being, Russia's standard of living is so far above that there's no prospect of that coming anytime soon.
All right, going back to the Russian military, why is it that they haven't reached or didn't reach their goals militarily in Ukraine?
Well, it depends when. In the early stages, of course, it was because they believed their own propaganda and weren't expecting to fight a war. More recently, it's because of the astonishingly dogged and courageous resilience and resistance of Ukrainian defenders.
Fair enough.
The end.
That's well put. How good do you think the Russian military is in terms of lessons learned? How good are they in renewing themselves, taking lessons from the either on a tactical level or on how well are they in scaling something they've learned in this unit over here to change their doctrine even or something?
It's always tricky when talking about Russian doctrine because you have to decide whether you're talking about the things that have actually been written down and you can see in print, or what they actually do, which of course is two very different fields of study. So yes, they have been effective, even if not necessarily efficient, at learning lessons and adapting, as you can see from the very different shape of the land forces now from where they were even in late 2022. Not to mention the rapid pace of technological overhaul, like for example the successive generations of UAVs, which incorporate new lessons and new technology and are constantly evolving at a very rapid pace. At the same time, of course, the counter to that is that the priorities for that adaptation and innovation and learning lessons are not the same necessarily as a Western military would do. So for as long as Russia is comfortable treating its soldiers as the corpora vilia, as the disposables, as the most disposable military commodity, there will never be the incentive to actually economize in terms of fatalities and lives lost that there would be in a Western military. So there's a different drive in terms of emphasis towards where lessons learned are actually going,
So
which
whether
can sometimes make it look as though they're not learning at all.
yeah, exactly. So they might not even want or need lessons learned in one sense, but also how they implement it is just a different view than how we see it.
Yeah, for as long as they are Shanghaiing Ukrainians off the streets in the occupied territories and sending them forward as bullet magnets, they for as long as they feel they have an inexhaustible supply, why would they do anything different? Because this works.
I know, which is just a weird thought process. Sort of on that note, reminds me of North Korea. How important is it to Russia that the North Koreans have joined them on there?
Well, if you believe the latest estimates that have come out of North Korean artillery supplies to the Russian armed forces of 9 million rounds, they've got to have gone somewhere. That's the actual practical support has apparently bailed Russia out of successive crises, both of shell supply and then subsequently to some extent of manpower as well. What's interesting with watching the behavior is one unknown and one unexpected. The unknown is what exactly Russia is supplying in return and how it's strengthening its North Korean partner in that part of the world where, of course, we have friends and allies like South Korea and Japan, and what that means for the war at the other end of Russia. And the other thing is the expectation that this initial contingent of 10 to 12,000 North Koreans would be just a trial run and it would be expanded on, which doesn't appear as yet to have happened, which opens questions about exactly what it was for. Does Russia not need it anymore? Has it accomplished its task, whatever it was, whether if it was a training mission for North Korea itself? Where is that cooperation going? And that, as far as I'm aware, is not clear from open sources at the moment.
Kind of jumping between topics here while I come up with questions. If we're talking about disinformation, how good is the West now at countering it, understanding, and just realizing that we're somehow the subjects of Russian disinformation?
Yeah, 3 very different questions.
Okay. Take your time.
Understanding. There's been so much ink spent on studying disinformation and how it works, and so many very thoughtful, really quite clever, very insightful studies into the disinformation problem. But the practical impact of those has been pretty limited. I wouldn't go so far as to call it admiring the problem, because these are very smart people that know what needs to be done about it, but there's a disconnect between that and then countries actually being able to bring themselves to take those measures. In part because, of course, in some countries, it's simply impossible to do that. If you have a regulatory framework and a structure of laws and a constitution and a society that is intrinsically unable to tell its citizens this is true and this is not, and that applies to quite a few of the countries that we're talking about, then it is always going to be an open goal for disinformation because there's no possible way of defending it. And that in part is also due to the third part of the question, awareness of the problem, which again is extremely patchy and tends to follow that same gradient of threat awareness that we were talking about before, from east to west. But in general, most Western democratic governments have done a really bad job of explaining to their citizens what is under threat as a result of information warfare. And the longer you leave it, the harder it's going to be.
How big of a part does information warfare, in your mind, play in the bigger picture of a war, of a conflict?
Well, it depends which conflict, and it depends who's waging the information warfare. Now, Russia, like any other country, would prefer to achieve its victories without actually necessarily going to war. And that is the reason why information warfare loomed so large in Russian discussions of how to fight wars after the seizure of Crimea, because that was the episode that was held up as the gold standard of how to do it, how to use information, and specifically information denial, information interdiction, to make sure that you could carry out this amazing geopolitical coup with only a few shots fired and with only one fatality, and that was an accident. So that's why Russia was looking so hard for where it could replicate that success anywhere else around the world, which led to this period in the second half of the last decade of this very intensive probing for vulnerabilities of communications infrastructure, subsea and space and on land and online, that was urgent from the Russian point of view because they wanted to be able to do it again. However, that's very different from the kind of preparations for information warfare that you see from other militaries elsewhere, where we've moved on from the situation when Russia first started focusing on this, that information warfare for some Western militaries was something you only switched on when a war starts, and it is very limited and tactical in scope. We've now got a bit more of a holistic understanding across many Western militaries of exactly what it means. But again, that's not quite the same as having the assets and the resources and the permissions to go ahead and do it when it's required.
I could talk on that all day, but
Yeah.
I am going to move on to Finland now. There's talk of this is interesting. I hope there are some international listeners online when there's or listening to when there's been talk of Russian troop buildups on the Finnish border. It's very much news for the international media, but it's not news here because there's always been troops there. There was a time between 22 and 24 where there weren't troops for obvious reasons there. But it's not that big of a deal. We're kind of used to them being there and threatening us. But it's obviously news for bigger news outlets abroad.
Mm-hmm.
How quickly do you expect Russia to be actually on its feet from, say, today, or if there's a ceasefire? How quickly can they be properly dangerous again, or actionable, or?
Well, here's where I defer to those people that are actually tracking those processes, the reconstitution, the expenditure of men and equipment, the finance, etc., all of the things that go towards making a force that Russia might think is ready to challenge a NATO country, whether or not it's actually true. Because the other thing to bear in mind in these conversations about where and when Russia might attack is that they are capable of getting it spectacularly wrong, just as they did in Ukraine. But the consequences, of course, are just as devastating, whether they're accurate in their assessments or not. So I look at the timelines, the assessments that come out from both professional colleagues and also now the intelligence and military intelligence and defense agencies across NATO states that are now fairly regularly coming up with forecasts for when they think Russia is going to be ready. And it is a space of time, of course, after major combat operations in Ukraine cease, because you no longer have Ukraine destroying the Russian military almost as quickly as Russia can reconstitute it. And so at that point, the brakes are off and the clock is ticking. And so the lowest figure that I've seen quoted so far is now 6 months from the Danish Defense Intelligence Service. But the trend is clear. Beginning of 2024, 10 to 20 years was the average assessment, including officially from NATO. Then that dropped very rapidly with the realization that Russia had fully reconstituted its land forces, at least in numbers. And suddenly you heard figures about 3 to 5 years, which is what I was collecting in this book. Since then, it's further. So the trend line is pretty clear. It's getting closer.
Yeah, that's a harrowing thought. How much lower can the number get before it becomes
Tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. Or not even an assessment of when it turns into an actual timeline starting today, as in just some number.
Well, that's something that has been lost sight of, I think, in all of the machinations about Trump and his so-called peace talks and trying to bring the war to an end, not necessarily with a positive outcome. Right up until January 2025, a ceasefire with no conditions was among the worst case outcomes for Ukraine and for Europe, precisely because of that reason. Suddenly, Russia is free to rebuild its military. It parks the Ukraine problem, and so it's going to be ready to attack somewhere else very much faster. Now, after Trump, that worst case outcome has been catapulted up the list to somewhere kind of, not quite so bad, not nearly as bad as Trump could deliver by other means. So, okay, let's go for that option, even though it is potentially disastrous for Europe.
From Finland's perspective, how dangerous, how big of a threat is Russia? We're not the Baltic states, but we're a frontline state. How worried would you be?
Again, this comes back to the permanent ongoing conversations about Russia's next target and what Russia would actually get from attacking somewhere. And I like to think that the frontline states are not quite as likely candidates as they're often portrayed as being. Not because they are not closer to Russia and easier targets, and not because they're not open to some form of coercion or military threat or military attack, but because of the return on investment that Russia would get from attacking them. So what would Russia actually stand to gain from tackling Finland or, for example, Latvia? Their problem is not the existence of Latvia or Finland, even though if you listen to President Putin, the borders should be dissolved because they're a mistake that was put in place by the early Bolsheviks. So really it should all be governed by Moscow, as we know. However, the simple physical lines on the map at the moment are not Russia's problem. Russia's problem is the international system which supports those lines on the map and supports Finland, Latvia, whoever, as being independent sovereign countries. So where could Russia target that international solidarity, whether it's expressed as the EU or NATO, or just that consensus among liberal democracies that you ought to do something about it if somebody gets invaded? It's probably not the frontline states, because an equally likely outcome from doing something to Finland or Latvia would be reinforcing that consensus. Now, with all of this, you still have the so-called fait accompli scenarios, the ones that have come back into popularity over the last few months, where Russia pushes forward 30 kilometers or so into a country, digs in and says, come and get us and we'll nuke you. So that is still an option, but it relies on Russia having a confidence in doing so, that it is not going to trigger a response from Russia. And it has to be a very, very high confidence, which I think sitting in the Kremlin, they would be wildly mistaken, but it's not impossible, wildly mistaken to think they have at the moment. But if, on the other hand, you do something which is either more covert or more ambiguous or less designed to be something which squarely satisfies the definition of an armed attack under Article 5, then you might achieve the same political effect of destroying that consensus, but without actually risking bringing that consensus together. And that's the reason why, by the way, what's the release date for our chat? Are you putting this out?
You can. Yeah. We haven't decided on anything yet. We can.
Okay.
We can play on that.
Make it the 9th of June.
Okay.
Because on the 10th of June, there is going to be a fairly major project released by Sky News in the UK. It is a podcast series with accompanying TV splash about a war game, about playing out a scenario for how Russia might attempt to coerce the United Kingdom, isolate it from its NATO allies, and bring about a change in British policy, which also exposes the fact that NATO is not effective as an alliance. And of course, after that, NATO disappears in a puff of smoke. It's going to be a 4 or 5 episode podcast. It's going to be pretty entertaining and pretty alarming. And the purpose of it is very deliberately to shame the British government into taking an interest in defense and spending on it. So it brings together the defense editor for Sky News, Deborah Haynes, and a lot of our former people. Ben Wallace, former defense minister, Richard Barron's former Joint Forces commander, other former ministers, generals, etc., names that are known, acting out or rather responding to what the Red Team, the people playing Russia, are throwing at them, and discovering that they have very, very few tools to oppose Russian coercion. So this is a scenario which reinforces that suggestion that it may not necessarily be Russia's western periphery that is going to be the most productive target for them to do something against.
So, yeah, I'm going to ask you about the new defense review soon, if I remember. So what you're saying is that the large-scale attack that we saw in Ukraine is a possibility, but Moscow is probably looking at different courses of action, and we should probably have plans for very different courses of action.
Absolutely, based on what is it that Russia is trying to achieve overall, strategically, and where is the best place for that going to be? It's not necessarily going to be moving forward 30 kilometers from the Belarus border to the center of Vilnius.
Yeah. Is that scenario sort of, in terms of like hybrid warfare, is that how you describe it, or?
I try to avoid describing anything as hybrid warfare, given that we've been pushing back against that terminology for a decade, given how badly it's been abused. But it's far better just to use the Russian phraseology. Call it spetsoperatsiya, special operations, because these are operations which are carried out by Russian serving military personnel and are effectively indistinguishable from war. Whereas if you call them hybrid warfare or gray zone warfare or liminal warfare or subthreshold or all of those other adjectives, it has the convenient political effect of making it something which is strange and unknowable, and we don't really know what to do about it, as opposed to just calling it warfare. But of course, that's a challenging political thing to do, because then you have to actually respond to it.
Which sort of brings me to what President Trump and Hegseth have been trying to push, this idea of peace through strength.
You'd like to think so, but of course that has been precisely the Trump-Hegseth program, finding out what Russia wants and then attempting to enforce it on everybody else.
The defense review. Do you have a take on that? It came out a couple of days ago.
Yes, it's a big, thick, hefty thing, 130 pages. It is a thoroughly sensible set of recommendations, which is reality-based. It doesn't talk about what a lot of people wanted from a defense review, which is to increase the size of British armed forces from their relatively tiny scale, partly because it recognizes that would be extremely hard to do. You can't magic manpower out of nowhere or mass out of nowhere. It's describing, if you summarize it very, very briefly, more like a tech refresh of British armed forces and all of the things that it describes in terms of what needs to be done. Integration, innovation. I think innovation is a word that comes up. I saw somebody had gone through and counted it. There is very nearly one mention per page of innovation. So it's a theme that runs right through it. And if all of the recommendations were adopted promptly, then it would transform the British armed forces and make them a great deal more fit for 21st century warfare and the international security environment that they're facing. Trouble is, the baseline assumptions for the review is that there is going to be a short-term increase to 2.5% of GDP being spent on defense, and then an increase to 3% shortly afterwards, which is very different from what the British current governing party has said they're willing to do. They've adopted 2.5%, although it's as usual, an accounting fudge. It's not actually new money. A lot of it is bringing security intelligence budgets into the military so that they can pretend they're spending 2.5%.
Yeah.
And then 3% by the end of the next parliament, they say, as fiscal and economic conditions allow. In other words, they've left themselves a get-out clause for just not doing it at all. So, some great ideas, big question marks over whether this government or any subsequent one is actually going to be willing to do it, let alone the practical implementation through a Ministry of Defense, which is not always best renowned for its functionality.
Right. It's interesting to follow that whole conversation, having had conscription in Finland ever since the Second World War, and there's a conversation somewhere in Western Europe about whether or not it should be brought back. It's difficult to bring something like that back once you've gotten rid of it, and then it often turns to make the militaries technologically advanced. But as we're seeing, you need boots on the ground.
Yes, there have been some spectacularly clumsy attempts to talk about conscription in the UK, and others which are a little bit more subtle and clever. But of course, it's poisoned by the notions that are too easily brought up of what conscription was like in the 1950s. It's huge numbers of unemployed 18-year-olds that are standing around whitewashing stones without actually having a purpose. So some of the more enlightened descriptions of what societal engagement in defense and resilience has to look like is talking more about the ways in which people get engaged in making sure their society continues to function, with echoes of the model that you have in, for example, Finland, Sweden, etc. But it's an extremely complicated balance to draw, because there are certain keywords that will trigger negative associations in the UK. Rishi Sunak, the previous Prime Minister, made a horrendous mistake by referring to it as national service. That's what the old conscription was called, and that is not what is intended. So that kind of put the whole debate back 6 months or a year. But it's still at a stage now where it is extremely difficult to have that national conversation.
I'm going to reiterate my question from before. We often boil Russia's behavior or responding to Russia's behavior down to Russia only answers to strength.
Mm-hmm.
Are we in the ballpark there in terms of?
Absolutely. I mean, we don't have it on the table here, but another publication, another report, another research study that I referred to this morning was called simply "What Deters Russia?" And that is, in a nutshell, the conclusion that trying to reach accommodations or compromises or a peaceful settlement with Russia, it simply does not answer, for all kinds of historical, psychological reasons, which I went into enormous depth in another book that isn't on the table, Moskovan Opit, the Moscow Rules book from 2019, explaining why Russia does all of this stuff. To which, of course, Martti Kari's subsequent book, of course, they go very nicely as a pair together. But the end result of all of this is, yes, absolutely, as you have described, the approach that so many Western governments have taken to dealing with Russia and Russian aggression has been directly counterproductive.
Perfect. We're at the end of our time. I could talk about this all day long, but thank you so much. And like we had here, read these books by Keir, and also the Finns. Read this book.
Yeah.
This is a good book. I'm going to be spending my summer holiday reading these more or less. I can't wait for the podcast series from Sky News. It sounds interesting.
Oh, it will be. It'll upset a lot of people.
Perfect. That's what you want. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.